A Fight with a Ghost. "No, I never believed much in ghosts," said the doctor, "but I was always rather afraid of them." "Have you ever seen one?" asked one of the other men. The doctor took his cigar out of his mouth and contemplated the ash for a moment or two before replying. "I have had some rather startling experiences," he said, after a pause, during which the rest of us exchanged glances. For the doctor has seen many things and is not averse to talking about them in congenial company. "Would you care to hear about one of them? It gives me the cold shivers now to speak of it." We nodded, and the doctor, taking a sip as an antidote to the shivers, began. "You remember George Carson, who played for the varsity some years ago, big chap, with a light mustache? Well, I saw a good deal of him before he married, while he was reading for the bar in town. It was just after he became engaged to Miss Stoner, who is now Mrs. Carson, that he asked me to go down to a place which his people had taken in the country. Miss Stoner was to be there, and he wanted me to meet her. I could not go down for Christmas Day, as I had promised to be with my people. But as I had been working a bit too hard, and wanted a few days' rest, I decided to run down for a few days about the New Year. Woodcote was a pleasant enough place to look at. There were 2 packs of hounds within easy distance, and it was not far enough from the station to cut you off completely from the morning papers. The Carsons had been lucky, I thought, in coming across such a good house at such a moderate figure. For, as George told me, the owner had been obliged to go abroad for his health, and was anxious not to leave the place empty all the winter. It was an old house, with big gables and preposterous corners all over the place, and you couldn't walk 10 paces along any of the passages without tumbling up or down stairs. But it had been patched from time to time, and, among other improvements, a big billiard room had been built out at the back. A country house in the winter without a billiard room, when the frost stops hunting, is just, well, not even a gilded prison. The party was a small one. Besides George and his father and mother, there were only a couple of Mrs. Carson, who, being somewhere in the early teens, didn't count, and Miss Stoner, who, of course, counted a good deal, and lastly myself. Miss Stoner ought to have been happy, for George Carson, besides being an excellent fellow all around, was by no means a bad match, being an only son with considerable expectations. But somehow or other, she did not strike me as looking either very well or very happy. She gave me the impression of having something on her mind, which made her alternately nervous and listless. George, I fancied, noticed it, and was puzzled by it, for I caught him several times watching her with an anxious and inquiring look. But as I was not there as a doctor, of course it was no business of mine, though I discovered the reason before I left Woodcote. The second night after my arrival, we had been playing, I remember, a family pool. The rest had gone upstairs to bed. George and I adjourned to a sort of study, which he had arranged upstairs, for a final smoke and a chat before turning in. The study was next to his bedroom, and parted off from it by a curtain. As we were settling down I missed my pipe, and remembered that I had laid it down in the billiard room. On principle I never smoke another man's pipe, so I lit a candle, the house being in darkness, and started away in search of my own. The house looked awfully weird by the flickering light of a solitary candle, and the stairs creaked in a particularly gruesome way behind me, just for all the world as though someone were following at my heels. I found my pipe where I had expected in the billiard room, and came back in perhaps a little more hurry than was absolutely necessary. Which perhaps explains why I stumbled in the uncertain light over a couple of unforeseen stairs, and dropped my candle. Of course it went out, but after a little groping I found it. Having no matches with me, I was obliged to feel my way along the banisters, for it was so dark that I could not see my hand in front of me. And as I slowly advanced, sliding my hand along the broad balustrade at my side, it suddenly slid over something cold and clammy, which was not a balustrade at all. for stopping dead and closing my fingers round it for an instant, I felt that I was holding another hand, a skinny, bony hand, which writhed itself slowly from my grasp. And though I could hear nothing and see nothing, I was yet conscious that something was brushing past me and going up the stairs. "Hi, what's that? Who are you?" I called. There was no answer. I admit that I was in a regular funk. I must have shown it in my face. "What's the matter?" asked George as I blundered into his study. "Oh, nothing," I answered. "Dropped my candle and lost the way." "But who were you talking to?" "I was only swearing at the candle," I replied. "Oh, I thought perhaps you had seen somebody," replied George. Somehow I did not like to tell him the truth, for fear he would laugh at my nervousness. But I determined to keep an eye on my liver, and take a couple of weeks' complete rest. That night I woke up several times with the feeling of that confounded hand under my own, a clammy hand which writhed as my fingers closed upon it. The next morning after breakfast I was in the billiard room practising strokes while Carson was over at the stables. Presently the door opened, and Miss Stoner looked in. "Come in," I said. "George will be back from the stables in a few minutes. Meanwhile we can 50 up." "I wanted to speak to you," she said. She was looking very tired and ill, and I began to think I should not have an uninterrupted holiday after all. "Do you believe in ghosts?" she asked, having closed the door and come up to the table, where she stood leaning with both her hands upon it. "No," I replied, missing an easy caroom as I remembered my experience of last night, "but I believe in fancy." "And, supposing then that a person fancied he saw things, is there any remedy?" "What do you mean, Miss Stoner?" I replied, looking at her in some surprise. "Do you mean that you fancy—" I stopped, for Miss Stoner turned away, sat down on one of the easy chairs by the wall, and burst into tears. "Oh, please help me," she sobbed. "I believe I'm going mad." I laid down my cue and went over to her. "Look here, Miss Stoner," I said, taking her hand, which was hot and feverish. "I am a doctor, and a friend of George. Now tell me all about it, and I'll do my best to set it right." She was in a more or less hysterical condition, and her words were freely punctuated by sobs. But gradually I managed to elicit from her that nearly every night since she came to Woodcote she had been awakened in some mysterious way, and had seen a horrible face looking at her from over the top of a screen which stood by the door of her bedroom. As soon as she moved the face disappeared, which convinced her that the apparition existed only in her imagination. That seemed to distress her even more than if she had believed it to be a genuine ghost, for she thought her brain was giving way. I told her that she was only suffering from a very common symptom of nervous disorder, as indeed it was, and promised to send a groom into the village to get a prescription made up for her. And, having made me promise to breathe no word to anyone on the subject, more especially to George, she went away relieved. Nevertheless, I was not quite certain that I had made a correct diagnosis of the case. You see, I had been rather upset myself not many hours before. George was longer than I expected at the stable, and I was just going to find him when at the door I met Mrs. Carson. "Can you spare me a moment?" she said, as I held open the door for her. "I wanted to find you alone." "Certainly, Mrs. Carson, with pleasure. An hour, if you wish," I replied. "It is so convenient, you know, to have a doctor in the house," she said, with a nervous laugh. "Now I want you to prescribe me a sleeping draught. My nerves are rather out of order, and I don't sleep as I should." "Ah," I said, "do you see faces and such like things when you wake?" "How do you know?" she asked quickly. "Oh, I inferred from the other symptoms. We doctors have to observe all kinds of little things." "Well, of course, I know it's only a fancy, but it is just as bad as if it were real. I assure you it is making me quite ill, and I didn't like to mention it to Mr. Carson or to George. They would think I was losing my head." I gave Mrs. Carson the same prescription as I had written for Miss Stoner, though by that time the conviction had grown upon me that there was something wrong which could not be cured by medicine. However, I decided to say nothing to George about the matter at present, for I could hardly utilize the confidence which had been placed in me by Miss Stoner and Mrs. Carson, and my own experience of the night before would scarcely have appeared convincing to him. But I determined that on the next day, which was Sunday, I would invent an excuse for staying at home from church and make some explorations in the house. There was obviously some mystery at work which wanted clearing up. We all sat up rather late that night. There seemed to be a general disinclination to go to bed. We stayed all together in the billiard room until nearly midnight, and then loitered about in the hall, talking in an aimless sort of fashion. But at last Mrs. Carson said good night, with a confidential nod to me, and Miss Stoner murmured, "So many thanks, I've got it," and they both went upstairs. George and I parted in the corridor above. Our rooms were opposite each other. I did not begin undressing at once, but sat down and tried to piece together some theory to account for the uncanniness of things. But the more I thought, the more perplexing it became. There was no doubt whatever that I had put my hand on something extremely alive and extremely unpleasant the night before. The bare recollection of it made me shudder. What living thing could possibly be creeping about the house in the dark? It was a man's hand, of that I was certain from the size of it. George Carson was out of the question, for he was in his room all the time. Nor was it likely that Mr. Carson Sr. would steal about his own house in his socks and refuse to answer when spoken to. The only other man in the house was an eminently respectable-looking butler, and his hand, as I had noted particularly when he poured out my wine at dinner, was plump and soft, whereas the mysterious hand on the balustrade was thin and bony. And then, what was the real explanation of the face which had appeared to the two ladies? Indigestion might have explained either singly. Extraordinary coincidents do sometimes occur, but it seemed too extraordinary that a couple of ladies, one old and one young, should suffer from the same indigestion in the same house, at the same time, and with the same symptoms. On the whole, I did not feel at all comfortable, and looked carefully in all the cupboards and recesses, as well as under the bed, before starting to undress. Then I went to the door, intending to lock it. Just as my hand was upon the key, I heard a soft step in the corridor outside, accompanied by a sound which was something between a sigh and a groan. Very faint, but quite unmistakable, and, under the circumstances, discomposing. It might, of course, be George. Anyhow, I decided to look and see. I turned the handle gently and opened the door. There was nothing to be seen in the corridor. But on the opposite side I could see a door open, and George's head peeping round the corner. "Hello," he said. "Hello," I replied. "Was that you walking up the passage?" he asked. "No," I answered. "I thought it might be you." "Then who the devil was it?" he said. "I'll swear I heard someone." There was silence for a few moments. I was wondering whether I had still better tell him of the fright I had already had, when he spoke again. "I say, just come in here for a bit, old fellow. I want to speak to you." I stepped across the passage, and we went together into the little study which adjoined his bedroom. "Look here," he said, poking up the fire, which was burning low. "Doesn't it strike you that there is something very odd about this house?" "You mean—" "Well, I wouldn't say anything about it to the master or Miss Stoner for fear of frightening them. All the same, scarcely a night passes but I hear curious footsteps on the stairs. You've heard them yourself, haven't you?" "Now you mention it," I said, "I confess I have." "And, what is more," he continued, "I was sitting here 2 nights ago half asleep, and it seems ridiculous, I know, but it's a fact. I suddenly saw a horrible face glaring at me from between those curtains behind you. It was gone in a moment, but I saw it as plainly as I see you. I moved my seat uneasily. "Did you look in your bedroom or in the passage?" I asked. "Yes, at once," he replied. "There was nothing to be seen. But twice again that night I heard footsteps passing. Good God!" He started up in his chair, staring straight over my shoulder. I turned quickly and saw the curtains which parted off the bedroom swing together. "What is it?" I asked breathlessly. "I saw it again! The same face, between the curtains!" I tore the curtains aside and rushed into the next room. It was empty. The lamp was burning upon a side table, and the door was open, just as George had left it. In the passage outside all was quiet. I came back into the study and found George running his fingers through his hair in perplexity. "There is clearly one person too many in the house," I said. "I think we ought to draw the place and find out who it is." "All right," he said, picking up the poker from the fireplace. "If it's anything made of flesh and blood this will be useful, and if not—" He stopped short, for at that instant the most awful shriek of horror rang through the house, a shriek of wild, uncontrollable terror, such as I had never heard before, and I never hope to hear again. One moment we stood staring at each other, dumbfounded. The next, George Carson had dashed out of the room and down the corridor to the stairs. I followed close behind him, for we both knew that none but a woman in mortal fear would shriek like that, and that that woman was Miss Stoner. Down the stairs we tumbled pell-mell in the darkness. But before I reached the landing below, where Miss Stoner's room was, I felt, as I had felt that evening before, something brush swiftly past me. As I ran I turned and caught at it in the dark, but my hand gripped only empty air. I was just about to turn back and follow it, when a cry from George arrested me, and, looking down, I saw him standing over the prostrate form of Miss Stoner. The door of her room was open, and by the moonlight which streamed into the room I could see her lying in her white night-dress across the threshold. What followed in the next few minutes I can scarcely recall with accuracy. The whole house was aroused by the poor girl's awful shriek. She was quite unconscious when we came upon her, but she revived more or less as soon as Mrs. Carson and one of the terrified servants had lifted her into bed again. Nothing intelligible could be gathered from her, however, as to the cause of her fright. She only repeated hysterically again and again, "Oh, the face, the face!" When I saw I could do her no further good for the present, I took George by the arm and led him out of the room. "Look here, George," I said, "we must find out the reason of this at once. I am certain I felt something go by me as I came downstairs. Now does that staircase lead anywhere but to our rooms?" George considered for a moment. "Yes," he replied, "there is a door at the end of the passage which leads up into a sort of lumber room." "Then we'll explore it," I said. "For my part I can't go to sleep until I've got to the bottom of this. Get the man to bring a lantern along." The butler looked as though he didn't half like the enterprise, and to tell the truth, no more did I. It was the uncanniest job I ever undertook. However, we started, the three of us. First of all we searched the rooms on the floor above, where George and I slept. Everything was just as we had left it. Then I pushed open the door at the end of the corridor. A crazy-looking staircase led up into the darkness. We went cautiously up, I first with a candle, then George, and last of all the butler with a lantern. At the top we stepped into a big, rather low room, with beams across the ceiling, and a rough, uneven floor. Our lights threw strange shadows into the corners, and more than once I stared at what looked like a crouching human figure. We searched every corner. There was nothing to be seen but a few old boxes, a roll or two of matting, and some broken chairs. But in the far corner George pointed out to me a rickety ladder which ended in a closed trap door. Just then I distinctly heard the curious half-groaning, half-sighing sound which had already puzzled me in the corridor below. We stood still and looked at one another. We all heard the sound. "Whatever it is, it's up there," I said. "The question is, who's going up?" George put his candle down upon the floor and stepped upon the ladder. It cracked beneath his weight. He stopped. "Come down. It won't bear you," I said. "I shall have to go." I don't know that I was ever in such a queer funk as I was while I slowly mounted that ladder, and pushed open the trap door. I had formed no clear idea of what I expected to find there. Certainly I was not prepared for what happened, for no sooner was the trap door fully open than there literally fell, upon me from the darkness above, a thing in human shape, which kicked and spat and tore at me as I stood clinging to the ladder. It lasted but a moment or so, but in that moment I lived a lifetime of terror. The ladder swayed and cracked beneath me, and I fell to the floor with the thing gripping my throat like a vice. The next instant George had stunned it with a blow from the poker and dragged it off me. It lay upon its back on the floor, a ragged, hideous, loathsome shape. And the mystery was solved. "But you haven't told us what it really was," said one of the listeners. The doctor smiled. "It was the owner of the house," he replied. "He had not gone abroad. He had gone to a private lunatic asylum with homicidal mania upon him. About a fortnight before this he had managed to escape, and having made his way to his former home, had concealed himself with a cunning often shown by lunatics in the loft. I suppose he had found enough to eat in his nightly rambles about the house. The only wonder is he didn't kill someone before he was caught." THE BURGLAR'S GHOST. I'm not an imaginative man, and no one who knows me can say I have ever indulged in sentimental ideas upon any subject. I am rather predisposed, in fact, to look at everything from a purely practical standpoint, and this quality has been further developed in me by the fact that for 20 years I have been an active member of the detective police force at Westford, a large town in one of our most important manufacturing districts. A policeman, as most people will readily believe, has to deal with so much practical life that he has small opportunity for developing other than practical qualities, and he is more apt to believe in tangible things than in ideas of somewhat superstitious nature. However, I was once under the firm conviction that I had been largely helped up the ladder of life by the ghost of a once well-known burglar. I have told the story to many, and have heard it commented upon in various fashions. Whether the comments were satirical or practical, it made no difference to me. I had a firm faith at that time in the truth of my tale. 18 years ago I was a plain-clothes officer at Westford. I was then 23 years of age, and very anxious about two matters. First and foremost, I desired promotion. Second, I wished to be married. Of course I was more eager about the second than the first, because my sweetheart, Alice Moore, was one of the prettiest and cleverest girls in the town. But I put promotion first for the simple reason that with me promotion must come before marriage. Knowing this, I was always on the lookout for a chance of distinguishing myself, and I paid much attention to my duties that my superiors began to notice me, and foretold a successful career for me in the future. One evening in the last week of September, 1873, I was sitting in my lodgings wondering what I could do to earn the promotion which I so earnestly wished for. Things were quiet just then in Westford, and I am afraid I half wished that something dreadful might occur, if I only could have a share in it. I was pursuing this train of thought when suddenly I heard a voice say, "Good evening, officer." I turned sharply around. It was almost dusk and my lamp was not lighted. For all that, I could see clearly enough a man who was sitting by a chest of drawers that stood between the door and the window. His chair stood between the drawers and the door, and I concluded that he had quietly entered my room and seated himself before addressing me. "Good evening," I replied. "I didn't hear you come in." He laughed when I said that, a low chuckling, rather sly laugh. "No," he said, "I dare say not, officer. I'm a very quiet sort of person. You might say, in fact, noiseless. Just so." I looked at him narrowly, feeling considerably surprised and astonished at his presence. He was a thickly built man with a square face and heavy chin. His nose was small, but aggressive. His eyes were little and overshadowed by heavy eyebrows. I could see them twinkle when he spoke. As for his dress, it was in keeping with his face. He wore a rough suit of woolen or frieze. A thick, gaily colored belcher neckerchief encircled his bowl-like throat, and in his big hands he continually twirled and twisted a fur cap, made apparently out of the skin of some favorite dog. As he sat there smiling at me, and saying nothing, it made me feel uncomfortable. "What do you want with me?" I asked. "Just a little matter of business," he answered. "You should have gone to the office," I said. "We're not supposed to do business at home." "Right you are, Governor," he replied, "but I wanted to see you. It is you that's got to do my job. If I seen the superintendent he might 'a' put somebody else on it. That wouldn't 'a' suited me. You see, officer, you're young, and naturally eager for promotion, eh?" "What is it you want?" I inquired again. "Ain't you eager to be promoted?" he reiterated. "Ain't you now, officer?" I saw no reason why I should conceal the fact, even from this strange visitor. I admitted that I was eager for promotion. "Ah," he said, with a satisfied smile, "I'm glad of that. It'll make you all the keener. Now, officer, you listen to me. I'm a-goin' to put you on to a nice little job. I dare say you'll be a sergeant before long, you will. You'll be complimented and praised for your clever conduct in this affair. Mark my words if you ain't." "Out with it," I said, fancying I saw through the man's meaning. "You're going to split on some of your pals, I suppose, and you want a reward." He shook his head. "A reward," he said, "wouldn't be no use to me at all. No, not if it was £1,000. No, it ain't nothing to do with reward. But now, officer, did you ever hear of a light-toed Jim?" Light-toed Jim! I should have been a poor detective if I had not. Why, the man under that sobriquet was one of the cleverest burglars and thieves in England, and had enjoyed such a famous career that his name was a household word. At that moment there was an additional interest attached to him. He had been convicted of burglary at the Northminster Assizes in 1871, and sentenced to 10 years' penal servitude. After serving nearly 2 years of his time he escaped from Portland, getting away in such clever fashion that he had never been heard of since. Where he was no one could say, but lately there had been a strong suspicion among the police that Light-toed Jim was at his old tricks again. "Light-toed Jim?" I repeated. "I should think so. Why, what do you know about him?" He smiled and nodded his head. "Light-toed Jim," said he, "is in Westford at this identical moment. Listen to me, officer. Light-toed Jim is a-goin' to crack a crib to-night. Said crib is the mansion of Miss Singleton, that 'ere rich old lady as lives out on Mapleton Road. You know her. Awfully rich, with naught but women servants and animals about the place. There's some very valuable plate there. That's what Light-toed Jim's after. He'll get in through the scullery window about 1 a.m., then he'll pass through the back and front kitchens and into the butler's pantry, only it's a butleress, 'cause there ain't no men at all, and there he'll set to work on the safe. Some of his late pals in Portland gave him the tip about this 'ere job." "How did you come to hear of it?" I asked. "Never mind, Governor. You wouldn't understand. Now, I want you to be up there to-night to nab Light-toed Jim red-handed, so to speak. It'll mean promotion for you, and it'll suit me down to the ground. You wants to be about and to watch him enter, then follow him and dog him. And he be armed, officer, for Jim'll fight like a tiger if you don't draw his teeth first." "Now look here, my man," said I, "this is all very well, but it's all irregular. You must tell me who you are and how you come to be in Light-toed Jim's secrets, and I'll put it down in black and white." I turned away from him to get my writing materials. I was not half a minute with my back to him, but when I turned around he was gone. The door was shut, but I had heard no sound from it either opening or shutting. Quick as I thought, I darted to it, tore it wide open, and looked down the narrow staircase. There was no one there. I ran hastily downstairs into the passage, and found my landlady, Mrs. Mariner, standing at the open door with a female friend. "Mrs. Mariner," I said, breaking in upon their conversation, "which way did that man go who came downstairs just now?" Mrs. Mariner looked at me strangely. "There ain't been no man come downstairs, Mr. Parker," said she. "Leastways, not this good 3/4 of an hour, which me and Mrs. Higgins 'ere as have come out to take an airing. Her having been ironin' all this blessed day, has been standin' 'ere all the time and ain't never seen a soul." "Nonsense," I said. "A man came down from my room just now, the man you sent up 20 minutes since." Mrs. Mariner looked at me with an expression betokening the most profound astonishment. Mrs. Higgins sighed deeply. "Mr. Parker," said Mrs. Mariner, "I'm sorry to say it, sir, but you're either intoxicated or else you're a sickening for brain fever, sir. There ain't no person entered this door, in or out, for nigh on to an hour, as me and Mrs. Higgins 'ere will take our Bible oaths on." I went upstairs and looked in the rooms on either side of mine. The man was not there. I looked under my bed, and of course he was not there. He must have gone downstairs. But then the women must have seen him. There was only one door to the house. I gave it up in despair and began to smoke my pipe. By the time I had drawn the last whiff I decided that if any one was intoxicated it was probably Mrs. Mariner and Mrs. Higgins, and that my strange visitor had departed by the door. I was not going to believe that he had anything supernatural about him. I had no duty that night, and as the hours wore on I found myself stern in my resolve to go up to Mrs. Singleton's house and see what I could make out of my informant's story. It was my opinion that my late visitor was a whilom pal of Light-toed Jim, and that having become aware of the latter's plot, he had, for some reason of his own, decided to split on his old chum. Thieves' disagreement is an honest man's opportunity, and I determined to solve the truth of the story told me. Lest it should come to nothing, I decided not to report the matter to my chief. If I could really capture Light-toed Jim, my success would be all the more brilliant by being suddenly sprung upon the authorities. I made my plan of action rapidly. I took a revolver with me and went up to Mrs. Singleton's house. Fortunately, I knew the housekeeper there, a middle-aged, strong-minded woman, not easily frightened, which was a good thing. To her I communicated such information as I considered necessary. She consented to conceal me in the room where the safe stood. There was a cupboard close by the safe from which I could command a full view of the burglar's operations and pounce upon him at the right moment. If only my information was to be relied upon, there was every chance of my capturing the famous burglar. Soon after midnight, when the house was all quiet, I went to the pantry and got into the cupboard, locking myself in. There were 2 openings in the panel, through which of either I was able to command a full view of the room. My position was somewhat cramped, but the time soon passed away. My mind was principally occupied in wondering if I was really about to have a chance of distinguishing myself. Somehow there was an air of unreality about the events of the evening which puzzled me. Suddenly I heard a sound which put me on the alert at once. It was nothing more than the creaking of a board or opening of a door would make in a quiet house, but it sounded intensified to my expectant ears. I drew myself up against the door of the cupboard, and placed my eye to the opening of the panel. I had oiled the key of the door, and kept my fingers upon it in readiness to spring upon the burglar at the proper moment. After what seemed some time, I saw the gleam of light through the keyhole of the door opening into the pantry. Then it opened, and a man carrying a small lantern came gently into the room. At first I could see nothing of his face, but when my eyes grew accustomed to the hazy light, I saw that I had been rightly informed, and that the burglar was indeed no other than the famous Light-toed Jim. As I stood there watching him, I could not help admiring the cool fashion in which he went to work. He went over to the window and examined it. He tried the door of the cupboard in which I stood concealed. Then he locked the door of the pantry and turned his attention to the safe. He set his lamp on a chair before the lock and took from his pocket as neat and pretty a collection of tools as I ever saw. With these he went quietly and swiftly to work. Light-toed Jim was a somewhat slimly built fellow, with little muscular development about him, while I'm a big man with plenty of bone and sinew. If matters had come to a fight between us, I could have done what I pleased with him, but I knew that Jim would not chance a fight. Somewhere about him I felt sure there was a revolver, which he would use on the least provocation. My plan, therefore, was to wait until his back was bent over the lock of the safe, then to open the cupboard door noiselessly, and fall bodily upon him, pinning him to the ground beneath me. Before long the moment came. He was working away steadily at the lock, his whole attention concentrated on the job. The slight noise of his drill was sufficient to drown the faint click of the key in the cupboard door. I turned it quickly and tumbled right upon him, driving the tool out of his hands and tumbling him into a heap at the front of the safe. He uttered an exclamation of rage and astonishment as he went down, and immediately began to wriggle under me like an eel. As I kept him down with one hand, I tried to pull out the handcuffs with the other. This somewhat embarrassed me, and the burglar profited by it to pull out a sharp knife. He had worked himself around on his back, and before I realized what he was after, he was hacking furiously at me with his keen, dagger-like blade. Then I realized that we were going to have a fight for it, and prepared myself. He tried to run the knife into my side. I warded it off, but the blade caught the fleshy part of my left arm, and I felt a warm stream of blood spurt out. That maddened me, and I seized one of the steel drills laying near at hand, and hit my man with such a blow over the temple that he collapsed at once, and lay as if dead. I put the handcuffs on him instantly, and, to make matters still more certain, I secured his ankles. Then I rose and looked at my arm. The knife had made a nasty gash, and the blood was flowing freely, but it was not serious, and when the housekeeper, who had just then appeared on the scene, had bandaged it, I went out and secured the help of the first policeman I met in conveying Light-toed Jim to the office. I felt a proud man when I made my report to the inspector. "Light-toed Jim," said he. "What, James Bland? Nonsense, Parker." But I took him to the cells where Jim was being attended to by the doctor. "You're right, Parker," he said. "That's the man. Well, this'll be a fine thing for you." After a time, feeling a little exhausted, I went home to try and get some sleep. The surgeon had attended to my arm, and told me it was but a superficial wound. It felt sore in spite of that. I had no sooner reached my lodgings than I saw sitting in my easy-chair the strange man who had called upon me earlier in the evening. He rose to his feet when I entered. I stared at him in utter astonishment. "Well, Governor," said he, "I see you've done it. You've got him square and fair, I reckon." "Yes," I said. "Ah," he said, with a sigh of complete satisfaction, "then I'm satisfied. Yes, I don't know as how there's aught more I could say. I reckon that's how Light-toed Jim and me's quits." I was determined to find out who this man was this time. "Sit down," I said. "There's a question or two I must ask you. Just let me get my coat off and I'll talk to you." I took my coat off and went over to the bed to lay it down. "Now then," I began, and looked around at him. I said no more, being literally dumbstruck. The man was gone! I began to feel uncomfortable. I ran hastily downstairs, only to find the outer door locked and bolted, as I had left it a few minutes before. I went back, utterly nonplussed. For an hour I pondered the matter over, but could neither make head nor tail of it. When I went down to the office next morning, I was informed that the burglar wanted to see me. I went to his cell, where he was lying in bed with his head bandaged. I had hit him pretty hard, as it turned out, and it was probable he would have to lie on the sick list for some days. "Well, Governor," said he, "you'd the best of me last night. You hit me rather hard that time." "I was sorry to have to do it, my man," I answered. "You would have stabbed me if you could." "Yes," he said, "I should. But I say, Governor, come a bit closer. I want to ask you a question. How did you know I was on that little job last night? For s'help me, there wasn't a soul knew a breath about it but myself. I hadn't no pals, never talked to nobody about it, never thought aloud about it, as I knows on. How came you to spot it, Governor?" There was no one else in the cell with us, and I thought I might find out something about my mysterious visitor of the night before. "It was a pal of yours who gave me the information," I said. "Can't be, Governor. No use tellin' me that. I ain't got no pals. Leastways, not in this job. Did you ever know a man like this?" I described my visitor. As I proceeded, Light-toed Jim's face assumed an expression of real terror. Whatever color was in it faded away. I never saw a man look more thoroughly frightened. "Yes, yes," he said eagerly. "In course I know who it is. Why, that's Barksey Bill, as I'd pal with at one time. And what did he say, Governor? That he owed me a grudge? That we was quits at last?" "Right you are, 'cause he did owe me a grudge. I treated Bill very shabby indeed, and he swore solemn he'd have his revenge. On ye, Governor, what you see wasn't Barksey Bill at all, but his ghost, 'cause Barksey Bill's been dead and buried this 3 year." I was naturally very much exercised in my mind over this weird development of the affair, and I used to think about it long after Light-toed Jim had once more retired into the seclusion of Portland. While he was in charge at Westford, I tried more than once to worm some more information out of him about the defunct Barksey Bill, but with no success. He would say no more than that Bill was dead and buried this 3 year, and with that I had to be content. Gradually I came to have a firm belief that I had indeed been visited by Barksey Bill's ghost, and I often told the story to brother officers, and sometimes got well laughed at. That, however, mattered little to me. I felt sure that any man who had gone through the same experience would have had the same beliefs. Of course I got my promotion and was soon afterward married. Things went well with me, and I was lifted from one step to another. In my secret mind I was always sure I owed my first rise to the burglar's ghost, and I should have continued to think so but for an incident which occurred just 5 years after my capture of Light-toed Jim. I had occasion to travel to Sheffield from Westford, and had to change trains at Leeds. The carriage I stepped into was occupied by a solitary individual, who turned his face to me as I sat down. Though dressed in more respectable fashion, I immediately recognized the man who had visited me so mysteriously at my lodgings. My first feeling was one of fear, and I dare say my face showed it, for the man laughed. "Hullo, Governor," said he, "I see you knew me as soon as you come in. You owes a deal to me, Governor, now don't ye, eh?" "Look here, my man," I said, "I've been taking you for a ghost these 5 years past. Now just tell me how you got in and out of my room that night, will you?" He laughed long and loud at that. "A ghost," said he. "Well, if that ain't a good urn. Why, easy enough, Governor. I was a lodging for a day or two in the same house. It was easy enough, when you know how, to open a door very quiet and slip out, too. But I followed you sharp, and looked for you." "Ay, Governor, but you looked down, and I'd gone up." "You should ha' come up to the attics, and there you'd ha' found me. "So you took me for a ghost. Well, I'm blowed." I told him what Light-toed Jim had said in the cell. "Aye," said he, "I dare say, Governor. You see, 'twas this way. It weren't Jim's fault I wasn't dead. He tried to murder me, Governor, he did, and left me a lyin' for dead. So I says to myself when I comes round that I'd pay him out sooner or later. But after that I quit the profession, Jim's nasty conduct havin' made me sick of it. So I went in for honest work at my old trade, which was draining and pipe repairing. I was on a job of that sort in Westford, near Miss Singleton's house, when I seed Light-toed Jim. I had a hidea what he was up to, havin' heard of the plate, and I watches him one or two nights, and gets a notion how he was going to work the job. Then, o' course, you being an officer and close at hand, I splits on him, and that's all." "But you had got the time and details correct." "Oh, why, of course, Governor, I was an old hand, served many years at Portland, I have, and I knew just how Jim would work it, after seeing his preliminary observations. But a ghost, ha, ha, ha! Why, Governor, you must have been a very green young officer in them days." "Perhaps I was. At any rate I learned a lesson from the ci devant Barksey Bill, namely, that in searching a house it is always advisable to look up as well as down." THE GHOST OF WASHINGTON. It was early on Christmas morning when John Riley wheeled away from a picturesque little village where he had passed the previous night, to continue his cycling tour through eastern Pennsylvania. Today his intention was to stop at Valley Forge, and then to ride up the Schuylkill Valley, visiting in turn the many points of historical interest that lay along his route. Valley Forge, his road map indicated, was but a short distance further on. All round him were the hills and fields and roads over which Washington and his half-starved army had forged and roamed throughout the trying winter of 1777-78, 126 years ago. It was a beautiful Christmas day, truly, and as he wheeled along, young Riley's thoughts were almost equally divided between the surrounding pleasant scenery and the folks at home, who, he knew very well, were assembling at just about the present time round a heavily laden Christmas tree in the front parlor. The sun rose higher and higher, and Riley pedalled on down the valley, passing every now and then quaint, pleasant-looking farmhouses, many of which, no doubt, had been built anterior to the period which had given the vicinity its history. Arriving finally at a place where the road forked off in two directions, Riley was puzzled which way to go on. There happened to be a dwelling close by. Accordingly he dismounted, left his wheel leaning against a gate-post at the side of the road, and walked up a wretchedly flagged walk leading to the house, with the idea of getting instructions from its inmates. Situated in the centre of an unkept field of rank grass and weeds, the building lay back from the highway probably 150 feet. It was long and low in shape, containing but one story, and having what is termed a gabled roof, under which there must have been an attic of no mean size. On coming close to the house, a fact Riley had not noticed from the road became plainly evident. It was deserted. He saw that the roof and side shingles were in wretched condition, that the window sashes and frames as well as the doors and door frames were missing from the openings in the side walls where once they had been, and that the entire side of the house, including that part of the stone foundation which showed above the ground, was full of cracks and seams. At first, on the point of turning back, he concluded to see what the interior was like anyway. Accordingly he went inside. Glancing around the large dust-filled room he had entered, his gaze at first failed to locate any object of the least interest. A rickety-appearing set of steps went up into the attic from one side of the apartment, and over in one corner was a large open fireplace, from the walls of which much of the brickwork had become loosened and fallen out. Riley had started up the steps toward the attic, when happening to look back for an instant, his attention was attracted to a singular-looking, jug-shaped bottle no larger than a vinegar cruet, which lay upon its side on the hearth of the fireplace, partly covered up by debris of loose bricks and mortar. He hastened back down the steps and crossed the room, taking the bottle up in his hand and examining it with curiosity. Being partly filled with a liquid of some kind or other, the bottle was very soon uncorked and held under the young man's nose. The liquid gave forth a peculiar, pungent, and inviting odor. Without further hesitation, Riley's lips sought the neck of the bottle. It is hardly possible to describe the pleasure and satisfaction his senses experienced as he drank. While the liquid was still gurgling down his throat, a heavy hand was placed most suddenly on his shoulder, and his body was given a violent shaking. The bottle fell to the floor and was broken into 100 pieces. "Hello," said a rough voice almost in Riley's ear. "Who are you, anyway, and what are you doing within the lines? A spy, I'll be bound." As most assuredly there had been no one else in the vicinity of the building when he had entered it, and with equal certainty no one had come down the steps from the attic, Riley was naturally surprised and mystified by this unexpected assault. He struggled instinctively to break loose from the unfriendly grasp, and when he finally succeeded, he twisted his body around so that he faced across the room. Immediately he made the remarkable discovery that there were 4 other persons in the apartment, 3 uncouth-looking fellows habited in fantastic but ragged garments, and a matronly-looking woman, the latter standing over a wash-tub which had been elevated upon 2 chairs in a corner near the fireplace. To all appearance, the woman had been busy at her work, and had stopped for the moment to see what the men were going to do. Her waist sleeves were rolled up to the shoulders, and her arms dripped with water and soap suds. Over the tops of the tubs, partly filled with water, there were visible the edges of several well-soaked fabrics. To add to his astonishment, he noticed that in the chimney place, which a moment before was falling apart, but now seemed to be clean and in good condition, a cheerful fire burned, and that above the flames was suspended an iron pot, from which issued a jet of steam. He also noticed that the entire appearance of the room had undergone a great change. Everything seemed to be in good repair, tidy and neat. The ceilings, the walls, and the door, even the stairway leading to the attic. The openings in the walls were fitted with window sashes and well-painted doors. The apartment had, in fact, evolved under his very eyesight from a state of absolute ruin into one of excellent preservation. All of this seemed so weird and uncanny that Riley stood for a moment or two in the transformed apartment, utterly dumbfounded, with his mouth wide open and his eyes all but popping out of his head. He was brought to his senses by the fellow who had shaken him growlingly out. "Come, explain yourself." "An explanation is due me," Riley managed to gasp. "Don't bandy words with the rascal, Harry," one of the other men spoke up. "Bring him along to headquarters." Thereupon, without further parley, the 3 men marched Riley in military fashion into the open air and down to the road. Here he picked up at the gate-post his bicycle, while they unstacked a group of 3 old-fashioned looking muskets located close by. When the young man had entered the house a few minutes before, this stack of arms had not been there. He could not understand it. Neither could he understand, on looking back at the building as he was marched off down the road, the mysterious agency that had transformed its dilapidated exterior, just as it had been the interior, into a practically new condition. While they trudged along, the strangers exhibited a singular interest in the wheel Riley pushed at his side, running their coarse hands over the frame and handlebar, and acting on the whole as though they never before had seen a bicycle. This in itself was another surprise. He had hardly supposed there were 3 men in the country so totally unacquainted with what is a most familiar piece of mechanism everywhere. At the same time that they were paying so much attention to the wheel, Riley in turn was studying with great curiosity his singular-looking captors. Rough, unprepossessing appearing fellows they were, large of frame and unshaven, and it must be added, dirty of face. What remained of their very ragged clothing, he had already noticed, was of a most remarkable cut and design, resembling closely the garments worn by the Continental militiamen in the War of Independence. The hats were broad, low of crown, and three-cornered in shape. The trousers were buff-colored and extended at the knees, and the long, blue spike-tailed coats were flapped over at the extremities of the tails, the flaps being fastened down with good-sized brass buttons. Leather leggings were strapped around cowhide boots, through the badly worn feet of which, in places where the leather had cracked open, the flesh unprotected by stockings could be seen. Dressed as he was, in a cleanly, gray cycling costume, Riley's appearance, most assuredly, was strongly in contrast to that of his companions. After a brisk walk of 20 minutes, during which they occasionally met and passed by one or two or perhaps a group of men clothed and outfitted like Riley's escorts, the little party followed the road up a slight incline and around a well-wooded bend to the left, coming quite suddenly, and to the very captive, very unexpectedly, to what was without a doubt a military encampment. A village, in fact, composed of many rows of small log huts. Along the streets, between the buildings, muskets were stacked in hundreds of places. Over in one corner, on a slight eminence commanding the road up which they had come, and cleverly hidden from it behind trees and shrubbery, the young man noticed a battery of field pieces. Wherever the eye was turned on this singular scene were countless numbers of soldiers all garmented in three-cornered hats, spike-tailed coats, and knee breeches, walking lazily hither and thither, grouped around crackling fires, or parading up and down the streets in platoons under the guidance of ragged but stern-looking officers. Harry stopped the little procession of four in front of one of the larger of the log houses. Then, while they stood there, the long blast from a bugle was heard, followed by the roll of drums. A minute or two afterward, several companies of militia marched up and grounded their arms, forming three sides of a hollow square around them, the fourth and open side being toward the log house. Directly succeeding this maneuver there came through the doorway of the house and stepped up the center of the square, stopping directly in front of Riley, a dignified-looking person, tall and straight and splendidly proportioned of figure, and having a face of great nobility and character. The cold chills chased one another down Riley's back. His limbs swayed and tottered beneath his weight. He had never experienced another such sensation of mingled astonishment and fright. He was in the presence of General Washington, not a phantom Washington either, but Washington in the flesh and blood, as material and earthly as a being as ever crossed a person's line of vision. Riley, in his time, had seen so many portraits, marble busts and statues of the great commander, that he could not be mistaken. Recovering the use of his faculties, which for the moment he seemed to have lost, Riley did the very commonplace thing that others before him have done when placed unexpectedly in remarkable situations. He pinched himself to make sure that he was in reality wide awake and in the natural possession of his senses. He felt like pinching the figure in front of him also, but he could not muster up the courage to do that. He stood there trying to think it all out, and as his thoughts became less stagnant, his fright dissolved under the process of reasoning his mind pursued. To reason a thing out, even though an explanation can only be obtained by leaving much of the subject unaccounted for, tends to make one bolder and less shaky in the knees. The series of strange incidents which he was experiencing had been inaugurated in the old-fashioned dwelling he had visited after information concerning the roads, and everything had been going along in a perfectly normal way up to the very moment when he had taken a drink from the bottle found in the fireplace. But from that precise time everything had gone wrongly. Hence the inference that the drinking of the peculiar liquid was accountable in some way or other for his troubles. There was a supernatural agency in the whole thing. That much must be admitted. And whatever that agency was, and however it might be accounted for, it had taken Riley back into a period of time more than 100 years ago, and landed him, body and soul, within the lines of the patriotic forces wintering at Valley Forge. He might have stood there, turning over and over in his mind, pinching himself and muttering, all the morning, had not the newcomer ceased a silent but curious inspection of his person, and asked, "Who are you, sir?" "John Riley, at your pleasure," the young man replied, adding a question on his own account, "And who are you, sir?" Immediately he received a heavy thump on his back from Harry's hard fist. "It is not for you to question the general," the ragged administrator of the blow exclaimed. "And it is not for you to be so gay," Riley returned angrily, giving the blow back with added force. "Here, here," broke in the first questioner. "Fisticuffs under my very nose! No more of this, I command you both." To Harry he added an extra caution. "Your zeal in my behalf will be better appreciated by being less demonstrative. Blows should be struck only on the battlefield." To Riley he said, with a slight smile hovering over his face, "My name is Washington. Perhaps you may have heard of me." To this Riley replied, "I have indeed, and heard you very well spoken of, too." Emboldened by the other's smile, he ventured another question. "I think my reckoning of the day and year is badly at fault. An hour ago I thought the day was Christmas Day. How far out of the way did my calculation take me, sir?" "The day is indeed Christmas Day, and the year is, as you must know, the year of our Lord 1777. Riley again pinched himself. "Why do you bring this man to me?" Washington now inquired, turning to Harry and his companions. "He is a spy, sir," said Harry. "That is a lie," Riley indignantly interpolated. "I have done nothing to warrant any such charge. We found him in the widow Robin's house, pouring strong liquor down his throat. I had gone inside after information concerning the roads." "Which he was getting from a bottle, sir." "If drinking from a bottle of necessity constitutes being a spy, I fear our camp is already a hotbed," Washington somewhat sagely remarked, casting his eye around slyly at his officers and men. "Tell me," he went on, with sudden sternness, looking Riley through and through, as though to read his very thoughts, "is the charge true? Do you come from Howe?" "The charge is not true, sir. I come from no one. I'm simply making a tour of pleasure through this part of the country on my bicycle." With the country swarming with the men from two hostile armies, any kind of tour, save one of absolute necessity, seems ill-timed. "When I set out I knew nothing about any armies. The fact is, sir," Riley started to make an explanation, but he checked himself on realizing that the telling of any such improbable yarn would only increase the hazardousness of his position. "Well?" Washington questioned in a tone of growing suspicion. "I certainly did not know that your army or any other army was quartered in this vicinity." Riley hesitated for lack of something further to say. "You see," he finally added, prompted by a happy idea, "I rode my wheel from New York." "You may have come from New York, though it is hard to believe you came on that singular looking machine so great a distance. Where is the horse which drew the vehicle?" Riley touched his bicycle. "This is the horse, sir, just as it is the vehicle," he said. "The man is crazy!" Harry exclaimed. Washington only looked the incredulity he felt, and this time asked a double question. "How can the thing be balanced without it being held upright by a pair of shafts from a horse's back, and how is the motive power acquired?" For an answer Riley jumped upon the wheel, and at a considerable speed and in a haphazard way pedaled around the place within the hollow square of soldiers. Hither and thither he went, at one second nearly wheeling over the toes of the line of astonished, if not frightened, militiamen, at the next bearing suddenly down on Harry and his companions, and making them dance and jump almost alertly to avoid a collision. Even the dignified Washington was once or twice put to the necessity of dodging hurriedly aside, when his equilibrium was threatened. Riley eventually dismounted, doing so with assumed clumsiness by stopping the wheel at Harry's back and falling over heavily against the soldier. Harry tumbled to the ground, but Riley dexterously landed on his feet. At once he began offering a profusion of apologies. "You did that by design," Harry shouted, jumping to his feet. His face was red with anger, and he shook his fist threateningly at the bicyclist. Washington commanded the man to hold his peace. Then to Riley he expressed a great surprise at his performance and a desire to know more about the bicycle. The young man thereupon described the machine minutely, lifting it into the air and spinning the wheels to illustrate how smoothly they rotated. "I can see it is possible to ride the contrivance with rapidity. It has been put together with wonderful ingenuity," Washington said, when Riley had replaced the wheel on the ground. "And you, sir, it is but a toy," an officer spoke up. "Put our friend on this bundle of tin and race him against one of our horsemen, and he would make a sorry showing." Riley smiled. "I bear the gentleman no ill will for his opinion," he said. "Still, I would like to show him by a practical test of the subject that his ignorance of it is most profound." "You would test the speed of the machine against that of a horse?" Washington said in amazement. "I would, sir. You have a good road yonder. With your permission and a worthy opponent I would make the test at once." "But, sir, the man is a spy," Harry broke in. "Would it not be better to throw a rope around his neck and give him his deserts?" "The charge is by no means proven," Washington replied, "nor can it be until a court-martial convenes this afternoon. And I see no reason why we may not in the meantime enjoy the unique contest which has been suggested. It will make a pleasant break in the routine of camp life." A murmur of approval went up from the masses of men by whom they were surrounded. While they had been talking, it seemed as though everybody in the camp not already on the scene had gathered together behind the square of infantry. "Then, sir," Harry said, with some eagerness, "I would like to be the man to ride the horse. There is no better animal than mine anywhere, and I understand his tricks and humors quite well enough to put him to his best pace." "I confess I have heard you well spoken of as a horseman," Washington said. "Be away with you. Saddle and bridle your horse at once." It was the chain of singular circumstances narrated above which brought John Riley into the most remarkable contest of his life. He had entered many bicycle races at one time or another, always with credit to himself and to the club whose colors he wore, and he had every expectation of making a good showing today. Yet a reflection of the weird conditions which had brought about the present contest took away some of his self-possession when a few minutes later he was marched over to the turnpike and left to his own thoughts, while the officers were pacing out a 1-mile straightaway course down the road. After the measurement had been taken, 2 unbroken lines of soldiers were formed along the entire mile, a most evident precaution against Riley leaving the race course at any point to escape across the fields. Washington came up to him again, when the preparations were completed, to shake his hand and whisper a word or two of encouragement in his ear. Having performed these kindly acts, he left to take up a position near the point of finish. The beginning of the course was located close to the battery of half-concealed field pieces. Riley was now conducted to this place. Shortly afterward Harry appeared on his horse. He leered at the bicyclist contemptuously and said something of a sarcastic nature, partly under his breath when the two lined up, side by side, for the start. To these slights Riley paid no heed. He had a strong belief that when the race was over there would be left in the mutton-like head of his opponent very little of his present inclination toward the humorous. The soldier's mount was a handsome black mare, 14½ hands high, strong of limbs and at the flanks, and animated by a spirit that kept her prancing around with continuous action. It must be admitted that the man rode very well. He guided the animal with ease and nonchalance when she reared and plunged, and kept her movements confined to an incredibly small piece of ground, considering her abundance of action. "Keep to your own side of the road throughout the race. I don't want to be collided with by your big beast," Riley cautioned while they were awaiting 2 signals from the starter. To this Harry replied in some derision, "I'll give you a good share of the road at the start, and all of it by my dust, too, afterward." And then the officer who held the pistol fired the first shot. Riley was well satisfied with the conditions under which the race was to be made. The road was wide and level, smooth, hard and straight, and a strong breeze which had sprung up blew squarely against his back. His wheel was geared up to 84 inches. The breeze promised to be a valuable adjunct in pushing it along. Awaiting the second and last signal, Riley glanced down the 2 blue ranks of soldiers, which stretched away into lazy lines in the distance and converged at the termination of the course where a flag had been stuck into the ground. The soldiers were at parade rest. Their unceasing movements as they chatted to one another, turning their bodies this way and that and craning their heads forward to look toward the starting point, and then jerking them back, made the lines seem like long, squirming snakes. At the end of the course a thick bunch of military men clogged the road and overspread into the fields. Crack! The signal to be off. Riley shoved aside the fellow who had been holding his wheel upright while astride of it, and pushed down on the pedals. The mare's hoofs dug the earth. Her great muscular legs straightened out. She sprang forward with a snort of apparent pleasure, taking the lead at the very start. Riley heard the shout of excitement run along the 2 ranks of soldiers. He saw them waving their arms and hats as he went by. And on ahead through the cloud of dust there was visible the shadow-like outlines of the snorting, galloping horse, whose hoof-beats sounded clear and sharp above the din which came from the sides of the highway. The mare crept farther and farther ahead. Very soon 100 feet or more of the road lay between her and the bicyclist. Harry turned in his saddle and called out another sarcasm. "I shall pass you very soon. Keep to your side of the road," Riley shouted, not a bit daunted by the way the race had commenced. His head was well down over the handlebars. His back had the shape of the upper portion of an immense egg. Up and down his legs moved, faster and faster and faster yet. He went by the soldiers so rapidly that they only appeared by 2 streaks of blurry color. Their sharp rasping shouts sounded like cracking of musketry. The cloud of dust blew against the cyclist's head and into his mouth and throat. When he glanced ahead again he saw with satisfaction that the mare was no longer increasing her lead. It soon became evident even that he was slowly cutting down the advantages she had secured. Harry again turned his head shortly afterward, doubtless expecting to find his opponent hopelessly distanced by this time. Instead of this, Riley was alarmingly close upon him. The man ejaculated a sudden oath and lashed his animal furiously. Straining every nerve and sinew, the mare for the moment pushed further ahead. Then her pace slackened a bit, and Riley again crept up to her. Closer and closer to her than before, until his head was abreast of her outstretched tail. Harry was lashing the mare and swearing at her unceasingly now. But she had spurted once and appeared to be incapable of again increasing her speed. In this way she went on for some little distance, Harry using his whip brutally, the mare desperately struggling to attain a greater pace. Riley hanging on with tenacity to her hind flanks and giving up not an inch of ground. A mile is indeed a very short distance when traversed at such a pace. The finishing flag was already but a few 100 feet farther on. Riley realized that it was time now to go to the front. He gritted his teeth together with determination and bent his head down even further toward his front wheel. Then his feet began to move so quickly that there was only visible an indistinct blur at the sides of his crankshaft. At this very second, with a face marked with rage and hatred, Harry brought his horse suddenly across the road to that part of it which he had been warned to avoid. It is hard to tell what kept Riley from being run into and trampled underfoot. An attempt at backpedaling, A sudden twist of the handlebar, a lurch to one side that almost threw him from his seat. Then, in the fraction of a second he was over on the other side of the road, pushing ahead of the mare, almost as though she were standing still. The outburst of alarm from the throats of the soldiers changed when they saw that Riley had not been injured. First into a shout of indignation at the dastardly attempt which had been made to run him down, and then into a roar of delight when the bicyclist breasted the flag, a winner of the race by 20 feet. As he crossed the line, Riley caught a glimpse of Washington. He stood close to the flag and was waving his hat in the air with enthusiasm of a schoolboy. Riley went down the road, slackening his speed as effectively as he could. But before it was possible to entirely stop his wheel's momentum, the noisy acclamations in his rear ceased with startling suddenness. He turned in his saddle and looked back. As sure as St. Peter, he had the road entirely to himself. There wasn't a soldier or a ghost of a soldier in sight. As soon as he could, he turned his bicycle about and rode back along the highway, now so singularly deserted, looking hither and thither in vain for some trace of the vanished army. Even the flag which had been stuck into the ground at the end of the 1-mile race-course was gone. The breeze had died out again, and the air was tranquil and warm. In the branches of a nearby tree 2 sparrows chirped and twittered peacefully. Riley went back to the place where the camp had been. He found there only open fields on one side of the road and a clump of woodland on the other. He continued on down the little hill up which Harry and his companions had brought him a few hours previously, and followed the road on further, coming finally to the fork in it near which was located the old farmhouse, wherein he had been taken captive. The house was, as it had been when he had previously entered it, falling apart from age and neglect. When he went inside, he found lying on the brick hearth in front of the fireplace a number of pieces of broken glass. Thank you for listening.